So, good morning, everybody. Good morning to everybody here and who's joining us via the live stream. Thank you very much for coming and welcome to our panel, Voices Across Borders, Journalism in Exile Amid Rising Autocracies. My name is Sonja Wimschulte and I work for the German foundation Körper-Stiftung. One of the aims of our foundation is to support people who are committed to democracy. Our work concentrates, on the one hand, on those who work for democracy within Germany. On the other hand, we also support those who have come to Germany and live in exile there. Those who have campaigned for democracy and human rights in their home country of origin, but were put under extreme pressure for their work and had therefore leave their home country. These people can be artists, activists, or journalists who wanted to exercise the democratic right to report freely. At Körper-Stiftung, we want to raise attention for their situation, to help them to be seen and heard, to network, and to encourage them to continue their work as journalists in exile. Therefore, Körper-Stiftung, among other things, organizes Germany's largest conference for journalism in exile, the Exile Media Forum, where we bring together all those who work in exile journalism. In addition, we publish reports to inform the public about the situation of exiled journalists. We have recently published our latest report, in which we describe the main communities of exiled journalists in Germany. It gives a vivid picture of the different national groups, their needs and networks. And by chance, we have some of the reports here. Sorry. Some of them are here, others are available in the festival bureau at Hotel Brufani. Please help yourself, take one or even two if you like to. But that's not why we're here today, so let us turn to our panel. The reality of exile has become a defining condition for many journalists who are forced to leave their homelands. Today, there are more journalists working in exile than ever before. A 2024 Reporters Without Borders study found that 70% of its emergency funds now go toward relocating persecuted journalists. More and more institutions offer safe spaces, yet the threats persist. Even in democracies, exiled journalists face digital surveillance, intimidation, and financial hardship. Anne Applebaum's new book, Autocracy Incorporated, The Dictators Who Want to Run the World, sheds light on how modern authoritarian regimes collaborate, not through ideology, but through the shared interest of silencing dissent. These authoritarian networks use propaganda, financial manipulation, and sophisticated surveillance to crush independent media. Journalists are not just running from repression, they are battling a global machinery determined to suppress free speech. So, what does this mean for exiled journalists? With me here to discuss this question is Yavuz Baydar from Turkey. Yavuz has 45 years of journalistic experience. He left Turkey for the first time in 1980 after the military coup, returned to Turkey and left the country for a second time in 2016 after the near coup against President Erdogan. Yavuz lives in exile in Europe and has published in various international media. Arzu Gaybullah from Azerbaijan. Arzu is a journalist, writer and human rights advocate. She left Azerbaijan in the early 2000s, not to go into exile for the first, well, we'll hear about that, but to work in Istanbul for another organization, among other things. In 2013, she began working for a media company, and which made her the target of numerous hostilities and threats from Azerbaijan, including death threats. She has therefore not returned to Azerbaijan for more than 10 years and is now in exile in Istanbul. Arzu publishes for various international media outlets. And Fatih Osman from Eritrea. Fatih began working as a reporter for Eritrea Al-Haditha in the 1990s. He left journalism and worked for several years in the diplomatic service for the newly independent Eritrea. However, when the government did not take the hoped-for path towards democracy, but instead turned in a kind of North Korea of West Africa, Fatih left and fled into exile in Paris in 2012. There he returned to his journalistic roots and joined the Eritrean radio station Radio Arena, the most important exile medium in Eritrea. He's now a freelancer. Thank you very much for being here. We'll start this panel with some questions from my part and the answers from our guests here. But at the end, there will also be some space for the audience to ask some questions. So keep it in mind, please. So let us draw first a picture of the attacks from the autocratic sides that still continue in exile. Or my question is, do the attacks continue in exile, and how do they do so? And I would start with you, Fatih, because in the ranking of press freedom from Reporters Without Borders from 2024, Eritrea is on number 180 out of 180 countries. Journalists are put in jail and never appear again. How does the government react to your work in exile?
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you for attending our panel. In fact, one thing that I should say, which I also feel sorry for, is that exile experience is like death, similar to it, in a sense that each and every journalist in certain situation of exile or deciding to flee his country is like facing a decision, and it's a horrible one. And that makes the experience itself varies from a person to another. The way they escape, the way they decide, the way they face problems, the way they just cope up with the problem of exiles is also different. That makes it so. So we all die, but we have our own different way of dying. And we have also our different way of just getting to exile. It's a gruesome fact. Eritrea, as you know it, is ranking always next to North Korea, 189 in the Index of Freedom of Press, annually issued by Journalists Without Borders or Reporters Without Borders in Paris. And it was 1 week after September 11 that the government rounded up all journalists, editors, and banned free press. And from that time on until today, all the journalists who were arrested at that day, 18 September 2001, they have disappeared. No one knows until today where they are. The lucky ones who made it and went out, and they have been living the terrible experience of exile. Some of them have just dropped the profession altogether. They are not journalists anymore. They are translators, they are social workers, they are wherever, but not journalists, even in exile. That's the experience of Eritrea with exile. Still, we can figure out a pattern, though it's a personal, different experience, but we can also draw patterns out of it, in the sense that in every country where there is a repression and there is conflict and there is intimidation to freedom of press, exile will persist. Journalists will be forced to take exile, and that's another problem. But this is what happens, and in our country, not only in Eritrea, but in the region itself. Now you can see Sudan is in flames, Ethiopia is not better, Congo is, and from all these countries, there are everyday journalists who flee for safety.
And Radio Arena, people in Eritrea could receive Radio Arena via satellite, online. Were there attacks against the radio broadcasts? Well,
the major broadcast way is the satellite broadcast. Internet is not available in the country. Only 3% of the population gets internet, and it's tapped. There is only one internet provider. It's government telecommunication service company, and Eritrea, with all indicators, is the least in internet service. That makes it very difficult to go through internet. So people follow radios and TV, and Radio Arena has been on this since 2009, all the way to now. And it's maybe the first radio that is followed and had following inside Eritrea. And the government, in intimidation, tried to block the broadcast in 2018. And it turned out that they had a blocking station somewhere southern Italy, here. And through Reporters Without Borders, which was a partner of Radio Arena, they filed a suit against the Eritrean government. But once the thing started to be known, it was dropped. It was not dropped, but the government stopped this blocking attempt to the broadcast.
I also read about agents from Eritrea who might visit democratic activists in exile. Did you experience something like this as well? So did you experience intimidation here in exile?
Well, there is the smear campaign. You go to exile, then you are a traitor. You are in France or Germany or Canada or wherever you are. The government says that you are paid by the intelligence services of this country to just work against your country. That's the first thing. Since you are a traitor, then they have full right, even to arrest you if it's possible. If not, then to make those who are pro-government work against you, attack you, like what happened to a colleague of ours in London who was beaten up in the street by a mob or pro-government supporters just because they considered him as a traitor. Now we are considered as traitors. And that is an uplift of any immunity against us. So they can just do whatever through. So it's risky, it's there. You get the threats, you get, even your family. I mean, let's take an example of many journalists who are in exile, but they don't cooperate. They don't talk about Eritrea. Why? Because their families are there. You go and talk, and then you just forget about your family. Myself, I joined Radio Arena only 2 years after I made quite sure that my family was with me. Then I started working for that radio. They were asking me to work, even in pen name and writing reports, and I said, it's not safe. So this is what happened. And as I said, some of them under intimidation or threat and things like that, just they drop being journalists altogether.
Thank you. Arzu, my next question is to you. And in recent years, especially since 2023, I think more and more journalists in Azerbaijan have been arrested. And more than 20 are currently in jail, and more are forced into exile. How does this development affect your work in exile?
Let me start by saying that the crackdown on independent media has been very much alive and kicking since 2012, 2013. The recent wave that we started experiencing in November of 2023 is just a culmination of ongoing censorship and crackdown on independent media, on opposition media, on journalists, on investigative journalists and whatnot. So we've had this pattern of crackdown for over a decade. And what we saw happening in November 2023 was sort of we've always talked about the nail in the coffin, or the final nail in the coffin. I think that was the nail in the coffin, because by that point, there were only a handful of independent media outlets left in the country, and it was only, a matter of these consecutive decisions to go after these journalists, completely on made-up, bogus charges, and get rid of any remaining voices, any remaining independent reporting on government corruption, on human rights violations, on wrong economic policies or political decision-making, and so on and so forth. And because we've already had this pattern of crackdown, exile journalism or Azerbaijani journalists living in exile isn't a new phenomenon either. We've had an exodus pretty much since 2016, circa the first crackdown and following the next few years. And the wave of arrests that started in November 2023 only increased that exodus. The problem is, first of all, none of those journalists want to leave the country. We are from Azerbaijan, ideally would love to continue living in this country and continue doing the job that we do, right? But eventually you have to make that tough decision. It's either exile or prison. Or, if not physical prison, you're stuck in a country that treats you as a prisoner because you're facing a travel ban, because your name is featured in one of the ongoing investigations. How does that affect journalism in the country, and how does that impact exiled journalists? I think the first question is easy to answer. If you jail every single independent journalist, there won't be any journalists left to write the truth. And for the second question, the exile journalism, as Fatih said, it's really hard to continue doing journalism when you're in exile. First of all, the whole process of relocation is quite complex. The emotional toll it takes on you, the mental toll it takes on you. And journalism is what you do, right? It's not like you can go and become a chef or, become a sommelier. I don't know, like what other professions one can do if you've been practicing your profession for years. So there is the mental toll of this relocation. You're suddenly in a place, in a country where you likely don't speak the language, you likely know very few people, and the chances of you continuing doing your journalism are very slim, because there is no mechanism in place that offers support to exiled journalists within local media in those countries, right? So that also impacts how the country is being covered by exiled journalists, because they struggle finding the platforms. Now, there are also exiled newsrooms. It's one thing to work as an exiled journalist in exile, and it's another thing to continue operating an exiled newsroom. I mean, I have friends here who operate exiled newsrooms in this audience, and the struggle is real. The funding is challenging. Making sure that your newsroom staff is safe and secure is challenging. making sure that you still have journalists on the ground who can, likely anonymously eventually, report on the stories that you still have to cover for your audience. Because at the end of the day, exiled newsrooms, their audience is still in the countries of their origin. So you have to continue producing stories. So how do you do it? And that just adds an additional challenge to reporting. Finding the sources, finding the stories, and making sure that those stories make it into the newsroom and are published. Maintaining that audience. You've been, a reporter for a popular online news platform in your country, and suddenly you're no longer there to continue providing that kind of coverage for the country. So that's additional challenge. And finally, I would say there used to be these physical challenges. We talked about safety, physical safety, because once you're in exile, doesn't mean that the autocratic government that you've escaped will stop going after you. There have been attacks on journalists, also in the case of Azerbaijan. There's also been attacks on bloggers and persecution of bloggers. Of course, the same sort of family pressure on the families left behind, also the case in Azerbaijan. But then over the years, we've also started seeing the additional sort of digital implications of authoritarian crackdown, and that just makes it very challenging. And I would just like to, I guess, wrap it up by saying none of us chose this kind of life. I mean, dying, you said. I don't know if that's, in many ways, that's the right. Pick your poison, yes. But I also truly believe that if this was the case in a handful of countries 10 years ago or 5 years ago, this is increasingly becoming a trend across the world. And we're just going to hear more and more stories of autocratic regimes forcing out their journalists out of their countries and forcing them in this space, in this environment where they have to find ways to continue doing their work. Otherwise, the real threat at the end of the day is you may not have any stories to read about a country.
Yes, you are also an expert on digital authoritarianism.
Unfortunately.
I want to ask the two of you, Arzu and Yavuz, because Yavuz, you told me about your situation that you were banned from X, not only you, but other journalists from Turkey as well. Can you say more about this? And then I would like to ask Arzu if there's a pattern in this.
Yes, thanks for each and every one of you, for the audience, for joining us. This is a topic that will not go away in the years to come, I suppose. And coming back to your question, the pattern is now, there are physical attacks and there are digital attacks. There are two levels. And the latter became more obvious, I would say, in the past 4 or 5 months in Turkey, as sort of an harbinger of what was to be expected in today's Turkey, which was Elon Musk's X cooperating openly, I would say disgracefully, with the authorities, in this case Ankara. Whatever came out as a demand from the judiciary, the Turkish judiciary, was accepted without questioning, without any question marks by X, and one after another, the accounts of our colleagues, including myself, started to be banned in Turkish domain. First signs were, for example, in October, November, when our colleague Amberin Zaman, who was covering basically the Kurdish issue for Al Monitor, she suddenly found herself out in the cold, totally blocked. And this wave continued with several other names. And in protest, actually, I declared in X that I was no longer going to be an active user of X, only a passive user with a ghost account in the middle of January. And in early February, I found myself also in the same situation as Amber Zaman and several other colleagues. And that was this kind of a second wave. And all of us started suspecting that something was coming in forms of crackdown. And later, as with the arrest of the mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, a larger pattern became visible with about 300 individual and institutional accounts of independent websites and independent journalists or critical journalists. They were also blocked. And this pattern continues, although many protests were handed out to X, no response. So it's a copy-paste kind of behavior from X. So that's the new pattern, the digital attacks. In order to excommunicate people in domestic stage or also on the exile stage. That's what we are seeing right now. And along with the crackdown, physical crackdown, arrests of journalists. Today, this morning, 2 more of our colleagues, our friends, were arrested in early hours. 2 of them were independent on a YouTube channel, investigative journalists, mainly focused on corruption, basically.
And can this be seen in other countries as well, Arzu?
I mean, last year we've published this really gloomy but very interesting report together with Citizen Lab on digital transnational repression. They've been doing a lot of investigations on digital transnational repression, and that kind of feeds into this digital crackdown that Yavuz mentioned earlier. And it's a pattern that exists across many different countries and follows exiled, not just journalists, but exiled civil society across the board in variety of countries. It is a concerning trend because, when we talk about digital crackdown, digital authoritarianism, there are so many layers to that, right? This includes, DDoSing websites of news sites or civil society organizations. It includes hacking accounts, emails. It includes sending phishing emails to journalists and activists and whatnot. It includes online harassment. It includes mass reporting to social media platforms for content removal. It includes trolling. It includes reputational damage that is being done online. It includes so much misinformation that is being shared about you online as part of this attempt to take you down, to tarnish your reputation, to make sure that you're portrayed as this. It's the smear campaign on a different level, on a different scale. Because while all of these attempts to silence you digitally exist, you're also being continuously suppressed and attacked offline, right? So state-sponsored media would publish long so-called investigative exposés about where you got the funding from, who have you been working with, what kind of stories you've been publishing, and so on and so forth. And this is a very, as I said, it's a pattern that it exists across many different countries. It's not just the government of Azerbaijan deploying information controls to go after its civil society, not just within the country, but also abroad. It's not just the government of Turkey working with platforms doing this. It's the Saudi Arabia, it's Russians, it's across the board. And what is really, I think, concerning in all of this is there are a very few sort of support mechanisms to mitigate these risks. There are only a handful of organizations that provide you assistance when you're being phished or have been phished, when your website was DDoSed, when your account has been taken down, and so on and so forth. And, we talk about, there's also a whole extent of online harassment that I mentioned. For that, there is no remedy at all because, yes, you may be like very digitally secure. You may have 2FAs and whatnot, but that's not going to stop someone coming after you and, wishing you a rape by I don't know how many people or, sending you death threats and so on and so forth. So there are not that many organizations that can prevent this or can offer you firsthand support. Luckily there are, but there are not that many to address a growing, just as the pattern exists and is becoming far more diverse, the threats are becoming more regular. And so there is a demand for more assistance, more mitigation, and in a lot of these cases. And finally, there is very little accountability for these kind of threats, right? When we talk about digital authoritarianism, digital threats, first thing that comes to mind are the platforms.
The what? Sorry?
Platforms, social media platforms. Have you seen any social media platform take on accountability or, take measures? No, because it doesn't. It's not a concern for them. What happens on Twitter, the fact that so many accounts have been blocked in Turkey.
May I add something? Yeah, I will just follow up on what Arzu is saying. What's new in this situation? What's new as of 2025? It's a downward spiral, basically. And it's multiplying. The cabin pressure that was over journalism, domestically or internationally, exile-wise or not, is increasing geometrically, let's say. What's new is that what we see in the United States, for example, of the cutting the hands and legs of organizations like National Endowment for Democracy or Freedom House, etc., those were the ones openly, giving lifeblood to journalism, independent journalism, to a great extent. They are being really thrown into the chaos right now. And what's new also, I think, is that the more autocracies align and build networks, as mentioned in the book by Anne Applebaum, Autocracy Incorporated, that is going to exert more and more pressure on democratic governments, especially in Europe, in the countries that are really keen on keeping the system of democracy, thereby also supporting independent journalism, the fourth estate, etc. That pressure, that cabin pressure, is already being felt over those democratic governments. And I'm afraid it will be a more open battle between autocratic way of dealing with judiciary, the media, etc., and a democratic way of dealing with media and judiciary, and etc. So we are heading there, and I think we will feel this most painfully in the exile journalism domain. That's the most important part right now, as I see it.
And just to add, what's really important here is a lot of the organizations that was just mentioned were also looking into investigations and the research on things like digital authoritarianism or information controls. They were supporting projects that were looking into it. And I think, the fact that we knew of Pegasus, for instance, being used, and a number of many other intrusive surveillance programs being used, and trying to detect who has been targeted, trying to clean the devices that have been infected, and trying to support the people who have been targeted with this intrusive surveillance has all been sort of intertwined in this, collaborations with international organizations, finding the right forensic lab that was supported to analyze the device, to clean it, to offer solution mechanisms, to offer support, and so on and so forth. And I think overall, because of these very much interrelated changes and profound shifts, actually, not just in funding, but also how much pressure has been placed on international organizations, and as a result on the local partners, I think speaks to a very simple reality that we are in a place where, and at a time where all of the existing coping mechanisms, mitigating mechanisms that we had in place are no longer really working, or at least they need a restructure or relook, because it's a gray zone. What worked isn't working, and it's just really mind-boggling to me that we were already in a crisis mode, and now I feel like has become much more harder to find ways to move forward and continue doing the work that we do.
I would like to add a different aspect or dimension to this problem in the European context, which is very weird and strange for anyone who listens to it for the first time. We have a problem of being uprooted, totally uprooted in the exile. You are exiled and you are uprooted. What kind of threat you face in your profession as an exiled journalist, as an Eritrean exiled journalist? A problem is you are totally disconnected from your resources inside the country. You don't have sources. You don't have contact with people to report about what's going on inside the country. Why? The government does not have that hacking. There is no internet. There is no that very advanced communication ways. No. Simply, they just go after the people who are in contact with the journalists, and they may kill them, just put them in prison. It's life and death threat in that case. Now, if someone volunteers calling Radio Arena or calling me to just give me information, I will not take it, not of fear for myself or my position or whatever, but for fear of the person himself. We tell even family members not to call us, not to write to us, not to even mention us. See, this is a life. You cannot just risk, for a piece of information, the life of someone. And it's easy, they disappear. And this happens today, that happened yesterday, it happens today, and it will happen tomorrow. And that's a time. That's why we ended up saying that practicing this exile journalism became some sort of spy work. You have to encrypt your way of contact with those who are inside the country. Of course, if you decide to just continue being an exile journalist, yeah.
We talked about autocracy incorporated. Do you see a chance when you say all this that there might be something like an exile journalism incorporated to support each other against these autocratic patterns?
Well, I think it's maybe important to underline what our colleague Margaret Sullivan had written a while ago, mentioning actually NATO context, the chapter 5, when a NATO member is under attack, the other members are obliged to protect that member. And Sullivan was bringing up this subject into the domain of journalism. If a journalist, individual journalist, or a news site or institution is attacked, there should be a sort of an agreement or understanding, ground of understanding to go and in defense of that. I think that's something to elaborate on further, and that article is there. You can just have a look at it. And I think there will be, as I mentioned, as the cabin pressure increases over the governments, over the funders, and also over the exiled journalists, I think there needs to be there needs to be a vision of a bigger picture, and including everything, you know, wherever we are as exiled journalists in democratic domains. I think there should be more cooperation, ground for cooperation, and more awareness about what to expect, because these are going to be more and more dire times. And that's what I would see as sort of you know, solidarity incorporated, or whatever you may want to call it. I don't know what Arzu would or Fatih would call it. So that's how I see it.
I mean, I know of a small sort of collective of exiled media that is already kind of doing this together with a few media partners from across the globe. A shout out to Nemo, if no one has heard of it. Highly recommend to look them
The
up.
network of exiled media outlets.
Yes, thank you. I think what's really important is, yes, of course, you know, whatever term there is for that. I like Nemo, actually. But I think there needs to be a very structured approach. You know, solidarity obviously is really important, but, you know, there are challenges that need addressing: relocation, readjustment, language training, working with host governments to ensure that exiled journalists, exiled newsrooms operating in their countries are, first of all, safe, they're protected, but then there are ways to support them in continuing the work that they do. I think it's really important for host governments to understand the importance of having exiled journalists or exiled newsrooms in their countries. I fear that in some contexts, in some countries, this isn't fully comprehended by the host governments, and therefore I think this also needs to be part of this operating scheme. And that's not the positive word, connotation word, but that's, I think there are a lot of things that need to be part of this network. Yeah.
I think I'm going to look at it in a different way. The problems that face exiled journalists are countless. We can just write volumes and talk days and nights about them. Let's take their problem. I think they all suffer of a problem that is, I can just term as tribalism. Now, in Africa, where conflicts, intimidation is rampant, journalists, when they are in exile, they just flock with their countries. From Azerbaijan, they just stay with each other, from Turkey, from Eritrea, from Sudan, and they don't have connections. This is a problem. Another thing is there is a sub-tribalism. Well, you have radio journalists siding together, press journalists siding together, technicians, and they don't have any relation together. How can you just get them together to understand that it's important to have something in common? Well, there are the barriers. It's my first time to meet, for example, a journalist from Azerbaijan, our colleague here. Maybe there are others, I see, like the Sudanese journalists who are flocking in troops, you know, to different countries, and Syrians who have been like for years in Europe. Though some Eritrean journalists report in Arabic, but they don't have that connection with some exiled journalists from Arab countries. That's another problem that should be. I mean, yeah. What's our part in the problem? That's what I should. I don't know what. But this is another way of blocking any way of initiatives to just get together, do something.
So it's the importance of working together, and I think it's these words are not toppable, if that's the correct word. But I promised the audience to have some time for a question as well. So let's seize the last 4.5 minutes, I think, for some questions. And I see a lady over there. And there's a colleague coming with a microphone. Oh, yeah.
Hi, I'm
sorry.
I'm the lady that I think you saw.
Sorry, I thought there was someone behind you.
Oh, sorry. Do you want
Did you? Oh, no, sorry. So there's a gentleman over here.
Okay, I'll go
Sorry.
ahead. I just wanted to ask a bit more about the cuts in US funding that were mentioned briefly earlier. We've seen big reductions in funding of independent media. I was wondering if the three of you could talk a bit about the impact of those cuts in your respective countries, please.
Who will?
I could briefly address that question, giving an example of an institution in civil society group in Turkey dealing with law and protection of journalists. And I was having a conversation with them about a month ago, and they were kind of in a panic, I would say, because they were pretty much reliant on the US funding of various organizations, and I heard complaints and concern that they were no longer able to pay, the legal advisors they had, the visiting, and also lawyers visiting journalists in jail or journalists in courthouses, etc. So that's the impact that's being felt more and more. I think that should explain a lot of what is the growing pattern right now.
In the case of Azerbaijan, foreign funding opportunities were already restricted way before Trump was elected president and enacted these series of changes on funding. We have a very restrictive bill on NGOs that has been in place for years, and we've had, as a result of this, we've also had an ongoing persecution of NGO directors, but also employees of NGOs who've received foreign funding from foreign institutions and states in the past. And actually one of the investigations that was closed has reopened, and we have now a new wave of arrests because of that investigation. Because of the restrictions that existed in place, there were, alternative ways of trying to get some financial support from international institutions in the past couple of years, but that has also been severely restricted. And now with the cuts, it has made it virtually impossible. I have colleagues, and I've heard from folks who have lost full funding. I have colleagues who've lost 20%, 30%. It really has a diverse impact, but all in all, it's been significant. But in the case of Azerbaijan, again, we've already struggled with obtaining foreign funds because of the restrictions that existed in place beforehand.
For this, I think Radio Arena is an example. The Eritrean radio based in Paris. It's one of the best Eritrean radios abroad, as I said before. Now this radio is facing 50% downsizing in all its activities and staff and everything. They got support from NED, National Endowment for Democracy, and that stopped. And they're facing problems, financial problems. Unfortunately, if all these continue, the radio may face the danger of stopping at all. So yeah, it's there, and the impact is felt. You see, it's felt when you lose like 50% of your capacity to work and produce. And there is no possibility that things go better. I think things are going towards being even worse.
Thank you very, very much. I am very sorry. Time has already run out. I just got a sign. But I want to thank you very much for coming today. I want to thank my guests, Yavuz Baydar, Ayzu Gabula, and Fatih Osman. Thank you very, very much for your insights. Thank you.
I think I'm available if there are any questions or side discussions.